Welcome to Crossroads. There are growing debates over whether President Donald Trump could suspend habeas corpus as a way to bypass the judges, blocking deportations, actually blocking a whole lot of other things. Habeas corpus, basically, here's what it is. It's a legal principle in the U.S. Constitution. It protects you and others from unlawful detention. And if Trump were to suspend it, it would be regarded as a kind of very serious method to carry out his agenda. But in a recent meeting, Trump suggested that while he may have this capability, he'd rather not use it. This was him making comments during a cabinet meeting earlier this week. Watch this.
You mentioned this last night in your speech in Macomb that we're facing an unprecedented situation where there's a lot of abuses of nationwide injunctions, sort of seemingly designed to curtail your power, specifically when it comes to deporting these illegal, violent aliens that came in under the previous administration. Have you spoken to your team about ways to mitigate this and continue to deliver for the American people on
well,
that
there
aspect?
are ways to mitigate it, and there's some very strong ways. There's one way that's been used by three very highly respected presidents, but we hope we don't have to go that route. But there is one way that has been used very successfully by three presidents, all highly respected, and hopefully we don't have to go that way. But there are ways of mitigating that. I want to thank you all.
Now, the key part in that statement is he references a power used by three former presidents, and many analysts took that and the context, which basically that power would be habeas corpus. But the three former presidents to refer to this because, look, it was invoked by Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and George W. Bush. Now, first off, though, I'll get into that, but on habeas corpus itself, basically, it's a legal principle, U.S. Constitution. It protects people from unlawful detention. It also establishes certain rights when it comes to imprisonment and detention, including some requirements on due process, the big narrative these days. For example, if you have to be brought before a court, they have to justify your imprisonment. You can't just send people off to prison or put them in El Salvador, basically, right? And look, this is important because this is one of the key issues we're now seeing with the programs for deportations. Many critics of Trump, including some judges, are alleging the administration is not following due process with this. That would be habeas corpus. And it seems not everyone is being given a court hearing before facing deportation, although the other argument is these people already had deportation orders. They were violating them. That's the other argument, basically. But this also includes people being sent off to foreign countries like El Salvador. Now, there are also some important details on this law, though. The President of the United States does have powers to restrict that requirement. This is something the President has. Now, it's something very delicate to use. Normally, you'd only use it under very extreme circumstances, but it has been done historically. Now, let me go over this a bit. Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution states this. It says the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. And what's happening now? Donald Trump has declared an invasion. He's also declared there's serious risk to public safety. So will he use this? Those are the exceptions when a president can remove those powers. Now, look, given that Trump has declared the United States is under invasion, invoked the Alien Enemies Act, also declared that mass migration represents a serious public safety crisis, again, that's his everyday narrative on it, right? Rapists and murderers and everything else, and gang members and terrorists. This is also given that many gangs have entered the country. Some could allege he has established the grounds to suspend habeas corpus. And this would, of course, be very controversial. You think it's controversial now? If he were to do this, it'd be a lot more so. And we'd likely see a lot of challenges on it. Donald Trump does appear hesitant to actually go all out with it. And he's even directly stating that, in fact. But again, it has been done before. Now, as Trump mentioned, this is a power that has been used by three great presidents before him. Again, he doesn't mention it directly, but going back in history, we can look at it. President Abraham Lincoln, right during the Civil War, suspended habeas corpus in 1861 to go after a large number of people who were rioting in military courts. He also used it to prevent the movement of Confederate troops. Again, Civil War, Confederates against the Union. He also used the power in 1862, 1 year after, to use martial law against protesters. What is martial law? Again, martial military law, the legal system. You're using military courts and military judges, right? Effectively, what would be court-martial against civilians. That's the way it works. You use the military courts instead of the civilian courts. Now, after Abraham Lincoln, President Ulysses S. Grant, a general during the Civil War, who became president, suspended writ of habeas corpus at that time, 1871, and he used it to go after the Ku Klux Klan. He did that at 9 counties in South Carolina. Basically, look, the KKK was a lot of former soldiers of the Confederacy, ended slavery, they did not like it, and they started going after black Americans. And basically what happened is President Grant declared martial law that allowed him to imprison members of the KKK and also people who were accused of instigating what they called racial terrorism. Good old terrorism, right? They were going after that time as well. And this let him do that without having to bring people before a judge or a court. Again, martial law, which would have been important during that time because who was the victor in the Civil War? It was the Union. Who was the leader of the Union? Well, Ulysses S. Grant. He was the leading general with it. And of course, well, who would control the courts? Well, the Union. And if they had to put the enemies of the Union, the Confederates, on trial because they were engaging in racial terrorism, well, that's better than going through the civilian courts where there was still a lot of division, especially in those states. And then with George W. Bush, he was the last one to do it. 2006, what did W do? He signed a law that suspended the rights of habeas corpus for anybody who was determined by the United States, not determined by a judge, but by the United States, determined to be an enemy combatant in the war on terror. And what did that mean? Well, effectively anybody accused of being a terrorist or a terror suspect, you did not have normal due process. You could be sent off to Guantanamo Bay. That was a law established 2006. And remember also, in addition to declaring an invasion, Donald Trump did do that. He declared the southern border represents an invasion of the United States. He declared a national emergency on it, and that's also why he's able to use the military there, by the way. He also declared a threat to public safety, and Trump has also designated the cartels and migrant gangs, including MS-13 and Tren de Aragua, as what? Foreign terrorist organizations. Foreign terrorists such as those that George Bush set into law in 2006 that would allow him to not use habeas corpus for them, meaning no due process for terrorists. So it does seem that some of the foundations are actually there if Trump wants to use it. Trump has kind of the foundations in place if he wants to say, hey, you know what? You don't want us using, you're saying we're not using due process? Maybe we just won't. But the real question is, well, whether it would be worth the very likely controversy, and especially doing that leading up to the midterm elections. Is that something he would want to do? It would be much more controversial. I think it's controversial now. It would be even more so if he were to do that. But look, on that point, there are also some analysts who suggest Trump has actually already done this to an extent. There are different degrees to which you can suspend habeas corpus, right? Writ of habeas corpus. He actually has suspended some elements of it already, technically. And he's already carrying out some acts that would be included within that power, in fact. Like, for example, what is he doing? Donald Trump is using the military for many deportations. These are military flights in many cases. He's already using the military for border security. In fact, they're even deputizing soldiers and troops. And of course, look, it doesn't go so far as an outright suspension or outright martial law, but to an extent, martial law is being used when it comes to the invasion of the southern border and, to a degree, the threat to public safety. Some elements are being invoked, in fact, at least not directly, but through additional laws and measures. And in addition to that as well, there are some additional moves along those lines. For example, in Florida, what's happening? Well, Governor Ron DeSantis, he just announced he submitted plans to the Department of Homeland Security that would allow service members, troops of the state's National Guard, Remember, in the United States, every state technically has a military, that's the National Guard, to allow the National Guard to become immigration judges. Keep in mind here, they're not saying have the immigration cases go through martial law, go through court-martial. He's saying designate the National Guard as immigration judges. They're kind of going this way, right? But it's kind of the same thing. In fact, this was Ron DeSantis during a press conference earlier this week. Watch this.
We have both a National Guard and a State Guard who are used to responding to different types of contingencies. We're ready, willing, and able to take it to the next level. We have submitted plans to DHS to say, if this is approved, we will go off to the races, and we will be able to do really from soup to nuts, from apprehension to detention, even putting some of our people in the National Guard in line to serve as immigration judges to process this. We can do it. And I'd also say, you hear a lot about due process. We have tens of thousands of illegal aliens in Florida at a minimum that have already been issued final orders of removal, and there's hundreds of thousands of them throughout the United States of America. So they've had a lot of process. They've been ordered to be removed. They have not complied with those removal orders, and that's a very, very high priority for our state efforts to continue to identify those individuals and make sure that they're returned to their country of origin. So I want to thank them.
Now, let's break this down. What is the difference between having immigration cases go through military courts versus having the military courts take over the immigration courts? Well, it kind of sounds like something having basically the same effect as martial law, only you're not calling it that, right? You're using the military system to bypass the regular courts, effectively, have them take them over. And when used for deportations, what would that do? That would have a very similar effect as suspending the writ of habeas corpus, at least to an extent. And some have also suggested that Trump's use of prisons in El Salvador actually invokes powers similar to what he would get by suspending the writ of habeas corpus, given that U.S. courts do not have jurisdiction there. Remember, with George W. Bush, him using Guantanamo Bay in Cuba was also very similar for terrorists. And people in that prison in El Salvador, well, they don't really have their ability to bring their cases before U.S. courts. Again, habeas corpus, to an extent, is suspended for them. And as we've seen also, even court orders to bring those prisoners back to the United States, they can just ignore them. El Salvador is refusing to send those people back. It's a jurisdiction issue. American courts can't do things in other countries. And look, it doesn't seem as much they can do about it at this point. So on that note, using a prison in El Salvador for these deportations also makes it, at least to an extent, an issue of foreign policy. And the Trump administration, they're even looking at additional measures like this, including, rather than having these illegal immigrants held in Texas to decide where they're going to be deported to, sending them first to El Salvador, having the holding systems there, then deporting them from there. What does that do? It basically suspends habeas corpus. And again, it's also because it deals with foreign policy. If you use a foreign country for this, technically it's not a domestic issue. It's a foreign policy issue at that point. And what does that mean? Well, Secretary of State Marco Rubio noted in a cabinet meeting yesterday that if you talk about these courts saying, hey, El Salvador, send this American back, that is outside the jurisdiction of U.S. courts. Watch this.
You brought up El Salvador in your remarks. Have you been in touch with El Salvador about returning Abrego Garcia as a formal request from this administration to make?
Well, I would never tell you that. And you know who else I'll never tell? A judge. Because the conduct of our foreign policy belongs to the President of the United States and the executive branch, not some judge. So we will conduct foreign policy appropriately if we need to, but I'll never discuss it. And no one will ever make us discuss it because that's how foreign policy works.
There's another piece to that as well, because in addition to like the jurisdiction of courts and other countries, there's also an issue of jurisdiction on the division of government branches. The elements of foreign policy are not something for judges to determine. That is a role of the executive branch, the president, and also the State Department. And that's also what they're invoking by saying, you have no power here, effectively. So, of course, look, not everybody agrees with this, of course. In particular, many of the illegal immigrants do not agree with it. The current policy is for the U.S. government to send many of them to holding camps in Texas. They're either deported to their home countries, but maybe also to El Salvador. And a recent video showed some of them forming an SOS, right? SOS, please help us, as a Reuters drone flew over them. And this is the Blue Bonnet Immigration Detention Center in Texas. You can see here the detainees are hanging around in the yard. They see the drone, they start waving at it, and they form the phrase SOS. Now look, on that point though, the video raised some additional debates over like how the individuals just happened to know that Reuters was going to fly a drone at that exact time. Were they just standing around there in an SOS like all day? Is this just what they do at every given moment? Or did somebody tell them? In other words, was this staged? Or are the prisoners there, again, people waiting to be deported, are they just always standing around in an SOS? Like, is this like an everyday thing for them? And there's also the fact that they are waving at the drone, suggesting that they are aware of it. So was it staged? Was it not? We may never know. But in addition to this also, there's the very real possibility that the Trump administration is working to implement some form of martial law, outright, in fact. This was actually included in one of the recent executive orders from Trump. This is the White House. Further in the document, this is what it says. Within 90 days of the date of this order, he did this week, the Secretary of Defense, in coordination with the Attorney General, shall determine how military and national security assets, training, non-lethal capabilities, and personnel, meaning troops, can most effectively be utilized to prevent crime. So look, using military and national security assets to prevent crime, including personnel, what does that mean? Well, if you use the military personnel to prevent crime, that means you're using the military to prevent crime. And what do you call that? You might call it, to an extent, martial law. Now, like, of course, it's possible this is not full in. It could be something, short of outright martial law. It could be that maybe troops are assisting in policing. Trump has also talked about the idea, in even previous administration, of deploying the federal marshals in states where, police have effectively had their hands tied behind their backs. New York City for a long time, Detroit, Chicago, California, for example. Not so much now, but especially during his first term, and especially during the BLM riots, Trump was suggesting deploying, again, federal marshals to effectively have federal policing. He's now talking about maybe using the military. Now, there's also the other side of this. It's also possible, this is more about like training and equipment. There were also parts in the order, notably about giving law enforcement agencies more access to military surplus gear. There's also the possibility they could give them training on how to use some of that equipment. And so, again, interpret it as you will. But look, folks, another story here. An announcement from the White House alleges the Venezuelan government, meaning Maduro and others, wanted to use the gang Tren de Aragua to carry out assassinations on American soil. This is Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, announcing this during a press briefing yesterday. Watch this.
You may have seen recently an FBI assessment that was unclassified that said that the Maduro regime is using and planning to use Tren de Aragua terrorists to carry out assassination plots on American soil. Now, very few in this room covered that. I'll let you all ask yourselves why you didn't cover it and why your editors didn't assign that story to you. That's something I think you should think about on your own. But this is a earth-shattering piece of news. The Biden administration
does seem to fall in line with the administration invoking what? The Alien Enemies Act, something Trump is fighting in the courts right now. Because remember, for Trump to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, he has to say that there's an invasion of the United States by a foreign government. Now, that included allegations, this is how he framed it, that the leadership of Venezuela is tied in with the Cartel de los Soles. That's the Cartel of the Suns. Interestingly, Trump didn't say that. Who said it? That was the Biden administration. The Biden administration declared that the Maduro regime is basically running the Cartel of the Suns. Trump noted the Cartel of the Suns works with the gang Tren de Aragua, and so by extension, the invasion of the United States by this gang and others is an invasion by a government tied in with a cartel. That is the basis of his declaration of a foreign invasion of the United States and the use of, again, that Alien Enemies Act. And so they're trying to defend it to an extent, right? But also on the point of foreign governments using gangs to carry out assassinations, that's also not something unexpected. Remember, this was also something that was being assessed when Iran, during the recent elections, was attempting to carry out assassinations within the United States. They arrested some guys in New York City who were accused of being hired by Iran to carry out assassinations of an Iranian journalist, and others, in fact. There were also allegations that the Iranian regime was planning to assassinate Donald Trump when he was on the campaign trail. That was also the basis of Donald Trump asking the Biden administration for greater security detail, which was denied. He was already being given pretty strong security detail. He wanted presidential level, which would include the international elements. Now, folks, on that note, again, we will see what happens with this. There's a lot of court debates for now taking place, whether it's habeas corpus, whether it's, again, the legal use of the Alien Enemies Act, and also the issue of foreign invasions and assassinations. But speaking of alleged assassinations, new evidence has emerged that the killing of Peanut the squirrel may have been premeditated. You might remember one of the big memes around the 2020 elections, well, 2024, it was for Peanut, and people had like all these memes going around of this little squirrel, fighting for the elections. Basically what happened, the squirrel and its little raccoon friend, they were euthanized by New York authorities. And the issue became one of the rallying calls for Trump, interestingly, behind the elections, even though the squirrel had nothing to do with politics, nor did the owners, as far as I understand. But again, Peanut the squirrel became kind of the flag bearing at the front lines of people going to the polls. And now Judicial Watch is saying that it got the evidence to suggest that the killing of Peanut the squirrel and Fred the raccoon was premeditated, even before the raid on the owner's home. This is what they said. They said, breaking. Judicial Watch received 163 pages of records from New York State Department of Environmental Conservation in a lawsuit which show authorities had planned to euthanize a squirrel named Peanut and a raccoon named Fred before they were seized from New York resident Mark Longo. Now here's a bit more on that. This is the official page they have on it. They include the documents as well. It's actually on that page. They even note excerpts from it. They say Judicial Watch announced today has received 163 pages of records from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation in a Freedom of Information Law FOIL lawsuit, which show authorities had planned to euthanize a squirrel named Peanut and a raccoon named Fred. Again, Peanut the squirrel and Fred the raccoon, before they were seized from Pine City, New York resident Mark Longo. It says the incident report from the raid on Longo's home shows that 12 law enforcement personnel, they sent 12 people to kill a squirrel, folks. 12 law enforcement personnel were involved in the October 30, 2024 operation to seize Peanut and Fred. The records also show that Peanut was decapitated for rabies analysis. That is normal practice. If an animal bites a person, they often decapitate it because they have to use the head as a way to test for rabies. But they decapitated the squirrel. This is after they say a wildlife biologist who seized the animal from Longo claimed to have been bitten on the thumb. And they add further in. And the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation's incident report dated October 24th, 2024, related to the raid on Longo's home in which Peanut and Fred were seized, the officers redacted the name of the complainant as well as 3 other associated persons. And it says the form indicates that 2 items of wildlife property were seized to be held, including a live raccoon and a live gray squirrel. It notes that both animals were seized and transferred to Redacted on October 30, 2024. And they also noted that a firearm model CT-42A, which is a semi-automatic 9mm AR-15 style rifle produced by Delta Level Defense, was seized and sent to a lab on October 30, 2024. The form lists the value of the animals and firearms as $0.00. They attached no value to Peanut the squirrel or Fred the raccoon. Now, on that point as well, again, if they say premeditated, one side of it is they planned to kill the raccoon from the get-go and kill the squirrel from the get-go. There was actually other evidence emerging even before all of this that had suggested that as well, including, some alleged communications. The other side of it is that effectively what happened was the owner of these animals had like, a TikTok channel and an Instagram channel, and they had videos of the raccoon and the squirrel was trained, and the guy'd walk in the door and the squirrel would jump on him. It was a pet, obviously, right? And the animal basically ran to the guy like a dog runs to its owner when he comes home from work. He had a lot of videos like this, videos of this squirrel wearing a little cowboy hat and things like that. And so the officials in New York got complaints from an angry neighbor who wanted to have those animals seized. You could imagine that, at least if they're going to seize animals, they would have to consider what would happen if you have to kill them. Maybe that was the premeditated part, just giving them credit. We don't actually know. But we can't expect there to be more on this because the owners have filed lawsuits on this. They're also trying to change some of the laws allowing for wildlife sanctuaries because they were trying to get the wildlife sanctuary licenses for these animals. But look, in other news, folks, it looks like 60 Minutes, Paramount, they're going to settle with President Donald Trump over an election lawsuit. And this is big. I'll be talking more about this after coming back from a quick break.
Experts agree. One of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges. With a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold, you can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Welcome back. Paramount, the owner of CBS, which has CBS News, looks like it is going to settle with President Donald Trump over his 60 Minutes election coverage lawsuit. Basically, Trump is alleging that the news show edited an interview with then presidential candidate Kamala Harris in an unfair way, making her look good, making him look bad, and that by doing so, it may have impacted the outcome of the election and maybe even violated broadcast laws. Because again, if you're using cable or even radio in the United States, there are certain FCC laws on that. Now, Donald Trump was suing them for $20 billion, a lot of money. And now, well, it looks like they're going to settle. Maybe not for $20 billion, but probably for a lot still. This is what he said on Truth Social. Trump said this: "The case we have against 60 Minutes, CBS, and Paramount is a true winner. They cheated and defrauded the American people at levels never seen before in the political arena." He said Kamala Harris, during early voting and immediately before Election Day, was asked a question and gave an answer that was so bad, according to Trump, and incompetent that it would have cost her many of the votes that she ended up getting. It was a disastrous answer. Again, she was talking about like Gaza and stuff like that. And he notes this: 60 Minutes and its corporate parents, in order that this not have a negative impact on her, removed and deleted Kamala's entire answer, every word of it, and replaced it with a response that she gave later on in an entirely different question. Basically, they cut and pasted like part of the video. They asked her a question, and then she gave an answer, and then they changed her answer to be something they discussed later, but kept the question in place. That's the allegation, right? Now, on the side of Paramount and CBS and 60 Minutes, they're saying they just edited it for TV, and that's kind of what they're going with. The argument from Trump is that if you give a bad answer, it can make you look bad, and that by doing so, changing effectively like her answer was an act of favoritism that was meant to sway the elections. That's this kind of allegation here, right? Now, on that point, it's not entirely wrong, because who remembers why President Joe Biden withdrew from the election? It was because he had a debate with Donald Trump. His performance was not rated very well. And after that, he got pressure from the Democrat Party and other key figures, even donors, saying they were going to pull out funding unless he stepped down and a new candidate was put in. They removed Biden from the presidential run because, again, when he was speaking, people had questions about, his ability. And so on that same ground, Trump seems to be alleging that Kamala Harris would have been in a similar boat. She didn't look good when she was giving this speech, and it may have changed the vote. Again, that's his argument, right? But further on this, Trump says this. He says, the new answer was not good, but it didn't show gross incompetence like the one that was removed by 60 Minutes. He said, in other words, 60 Minutes perpetuated a giant fraud against the American people, the Federal Elections Commission, the FEC, and the Federal Communications System, including probably the FCC, which I'll get into. And he said this also, despite all of the above, and Paramount, CBS, 60 Minutes admittance to this crime, there's some caveat to that. They did not admit they did that. They claimed it was just edited for TV, and so there's a bit of overstep here. And he said, and with other similar corrupt removals of answers to questions, the failing New York Times, which is fake news both in writing and polling, claims that people said that the case is baseless. He said they don't mean that. They just have a non-curable case of Trump derangement syndrome, possibly to the point where the New York Times' interjection makes them liable for tortious interference, including in elections, which we are intently studying. Maybe they will be sued as well, in other words. And he says the bottom line is that 60 Minutes and its corporate owners have committed. He said it's one of the most egregious illegalities in broadcast history. Nothing like this. The illegal creation of an answer for a presidential candidate has ever been done before. He says they have to pay a price for it, and the Times, New York Times, should also be on the hook for their likely unlawful behavior. It is vital to hold these liars and fraudsters accountable. Again, that's Trump, and again, he's probably going to be the one on the winning side of this. Now, aside from the lawsuit, again, because they're going to settle on it, right? They're saying they're going to settle. And there's a lot of pressure for them to not settle, by the way, including a lot from the left. A lot of Democrats are very unhappy that they seem like they're going to settle with it. But aside from the lawsuit, there's also the possibility the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, they may also step in. Trump, again, is alleging they may have violated FEC, Federal Elections Commission, and FCC, Federal Communications Commission laws in the United States. And the FCC has actually been weighing in on this, on whether, the networks, some of them, not this directly so much, but whether a lot of networks could even lose their broadcast licenses on cable TV and maybe even radio over politically biased coverage. Now, Rasmussen reports noted that it appears the allegations in the 60 Minutes lawsuit, which is probably part of the problem with discovery, all this stuff is revealed to the public. Evidence now shown to the public, they say that it could lead to further investigations from the FCC. And Rasmussen noted, quote, this isn't a producer problem or a news division problem, it's an ownership problem, again, they say. And they say ownership could see these license violations week after week, year after year. FCC violations, they're saying. They say they supported them, they will end up paying for them. Now, we'll see what happens. The whole issue is also being kind of complicated because there's a planned merger with some of the companies involved in this. And that also ties into additional issues with the FCC, in fact. Here's a bit more on that. This is Ars Technica. It says CBS owner Paramount is reportedly nearing a settlement with President Donald Trump over his claim that 60 Minutes deceptively manipulated a pre-election interview with Kamala Harris. They say Trump's complaint filed against Paramount and CBS in a federal court in Texas seeks at least $20 billion in damages. And it says the lawsuit has been widely described as frivolous. Widely described by whom? Well, mostly the corporate media on their side, not so much the other side. They often do that, by the way. Media, corporate media that are kind of all ideologically aligned will have a common narrative, and then they cite each other to claim that it's widely described. But again, it's basically means just partisan described. One side of the political aisle says it. Actually, on this note, though, even some Republicans, some Republicans have actually agreed that this is kind of frivolous. But they say this. It appears that Paramount is motivated to settle the case while it seeks the Trump administration's approval for a merger with Skydance. And so the allegation here is that they claim that the settlement is not so much about the content of the lawsuit, but instead against possibilities that the merger could be blocked. That is their allegation. Whether that is true, it's personal opinion. You be the judge. But they say this as well. They say the Paramount board, quote, acted to provide clear guidance to lawyers who will be representing them during the mediation process, the Los Angeles Times wrote. And it says the mediation session set to begin today, again recently. The newspaper said its sources indicate, quote, the company is eager to put the 60 Minutes controversy behind it so that it can move forward with its sale to David Ellison's Skydance Media. It says to complete the merger, Paramount needs Federal Communications Commission, FCC, approval to transfer TV broadcast station licenses to Skydance. They say the Biden-era FCC dismissed a complaint filed by a conservative group against CBS, again also involved with this, about the Harris interview. But Chairman Brendan Carr, now with the FCC, revived that complaint a couple days after Trump appointed him to lead the commission, the FCC. And they say Carr is using the FCC's rarely enforced news distortion policy. It's important here because basically it's a law. It actually is a policy. It's just not enforced typically, to investigate CBS, and said the probe is a factor in the FCC's review of the Paramount-Skydance merger. While the complaint and merger review are ostensibly separate from Trump's lawsuit against Paramount and CBS, it would not be surprising, they claim, if a settlement with Trump helps Paramount in both FCC proceedings. Why is that? It's because, again, were Trump to win this, it could directly impact the view of that rule within the FCC. If Trump were to win the lawsuit, basically the FCC could say a court determined that this took place, and that would be very bad for them. And they say this as well in a statement provided to Ars Technica today. Paramount said, quote, the lawsuit is completely separate from and unrelated to the Skydance transaction and the FCC approval process. They're trying to separate these things. And they say, we will abide by the legal process to defend our case. Now, that said, folks, is this really about an FCC deal? Is it because they did, in fact, selectively alter an interview? Is this something they often do? For example, taking quotes out of context to make people they like sound better and people they don't like sound worse. We could say they often do both of these, frankly. Not necessarily CBS, but a lot of the corporate media in general. And of course, that's also something we saw a ton of during Trump's first term in office, when media were very often selectively editing things, deleting footage, and splicing together content to make the people they liked look better and the people they hated look a lot worse. And of course, with Trump going after these media, he dealt with it not even just his first term in office. He dealt with it like the last 4 years as well. He seems like he's tired of it, and he's kind of pulling out all stops right now, is the way it looks. They're going after a lot of these media right now. And a lot of these media, even aside from possible lawsuits, again, Trump is suggesting maybe even additional ones now. The FCC is also going after the broadcast licenses of many of them, TV and radio, most notably. That said, folks, hit the like button, leave a comment. Let's jump into some questions. And first off here, Martin McKenzie, you're saying, I am flummoxed at the notion that someone who entered the country illegally has any rights to due process. Yeah, and I mean, and that's part of the problem too. Now, part of the problem we have is you do have immigration courts. Immigration courts do make some determination over whether a person should be deported. And, you know, you got to understand, this is not necessarily to protect illegal immigrants. It's more to determine whether they are, in fact, illegal immigrants. And that's also why the media right now, you know, the corporate media, making allegations that Trump is deporting American citizens. Trump is deporting a Maryland father, right? They're not saying he's deporting illegal immigrants. The basis of that is that they're effectively alleging that a court did not determine whether, in fact, these people are illegal. What is the actual context of that? The deportation of American citizens. The Trump administration clarified that. What happened was, if you have like a single mom and she's deported and her kid is an American citizen, because we know we have anchor baby policies, birthright citizenship, they come here, they give birth here, the kid is a citizen, they're obviously illegal aliens, you deport them, but because of our very open birthright citizenship laws, the kid is an American citizen. What do? Well, they can either put their kid up for adoption, leave them with a family member, or take them with them. And so the Trump administration has opened that option, that if the parents request for the kid to be brought with them, they're brought with them. And so the media has been using that to say that Trump is deporting American citizens. That's the actual basis of that. Now, when they've been questioned about how could you do this to a family, the Trump administration is saying, well, look, if you allow people to come here, give birth, and the kid's an American citizen, and a lot of people are gaming that system, by the way, to the extent that in Texas, illegal aliens, they just cross the border and use the emergency room systems at hospitals to get free health care. Not even just illegal immigrants, but just people coming in to give birth or get free health care. Because again, they can't legally turn you away because of the laws with the hospitals. The hospital bills are insane. If you want to know why hospitals are going out of business and why your hospital bills are so expensive, that's part of the reason. It's because we allow non-citizens, homeless people, and just illegal aliens to use that, and there's no way to hold them accountable for it. And so they're effectively collapsing the hospital system in some states. Now, what do you do, though? If you were to tell people, okay, if you come here as an illegal immigrant, give birth, have a kid, the kid is now a citizen, we cannot deport you, what do you think is going to happen? Probably every person who wants to enter the United States would probably come here and give birth because he can never be deported. That's the argument, right? And so they're saying, well, how can we even have like immigration laws if we let that happen? And then not to mention, you have chain migration. They can bring in their family members and their cousins and so on like that. It's even a problem with visas where you let them do that. So that is the problem. That is the issue. And keep in mind, too, that because, you don't have to come to the United States illegally, technically, if you're visiting for a day. If you have somebody cross over to the United States, a woman's pregnant, she's planning to give birth here, she does not technically even have to enter the country illegally. She can walk through a border entrance saying, I'm visiting for a day, or maybe a couple weeks, because you don't know when you're going to give birth, or unless you have a C-section. And then give birth, and boom, you're here forever. That's the argument, right? But back to this point about people alleging that, they have due process. The due process is based more on the idea of determining whether they are in fact illegal immigrants. Because, you don't want to be deporting people who are not illegal immigrants. If, for example, Immigration Customs Enforcement goes into a house and they're arresting a Tren de Aragua member, and there's 5 guys there, and they arrest them as well, and then they say, you know what, they're all illegal immigrants, and one guy happens to not be, normally you have a system there to make sure that guy's not deported with everybody else. The other side of the argument from the Trump side is they're saying that basically most of these people already have orders to remove themselves from the country. And so he's saying they already have deportation orders. And so if a person has already been determined to be an illegal immigrant, if a person already has a court order to be deported, then why do you need an additional due process to redetermine that they should be deported? And that's kind of the logic here. They're noting the number of people who have orders to deport are so massive that you don't really need an additional process to say yet again that they should be deported. The guy who was deported from El Salvador, the one making all this case, right, the accused MS-13 member, he had orders to deport already. He was previously deported from, if I remember right. And so why do you give him another court case to determine if he should be deported? Like that's the argument here, right? That's the basis for these things. And then the other big issue too is, look, if you have 20 million people, right? 10 million under Joe Biden alone, 20 million people, at least according to the Trump administration, that are even known, and they say that the number is probably much higher than that. If you want to have due process for 20 million people, you will never, ever, ever fix this problem. And again, that's part of the argument, maybe that they can have a streamlined process. Again, if the military carries out deportations, if Trump suspends writ of habeas corpus, you have the military do it, you have military courts, they streamline it, basically, as part of the deportation process, streamline it, instead of having like a 9-month waiting time and the whole court process. It's a military judge basically with a rubber stamp. Then you can make it a lot faster. And that is also part of the argument on habeas corpus, by the way, using military courts to do it. Because then you have due process, but it's much faster. And that's the other argument with him. KM, you're saying, I don't think a lot of people understand the domino effect has occurred with these illegal immigrants. The overwhelming of schools, the taking of our jobs, our tax dollars supporting them, the housing market, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, and I would add to that, again, the pressure on hospitals, because, look, folks, if you were here illegally, right, you were effectively told, come to America, we're not going to deport you, we'll give you a free house, we'll give you a car, you can have free health care, free Medicare, unemployment. Gee, I mean, it's like winning the lottery, you know what I mean? Even just being able to come to the U.S., it's like winning the lottery for some of these countries. Why wouldn't you come? Obviously, and a lot of them did. You come here, you technically don't even have to work. If you do decide to work, what else do you get? Well, you get all kinds of other things. And then you can send money home, right? Of course, the issue of remittances. People work here, they send money outside the country. Remittances are actually horrible for the U.S. economy as well, I should note. Remittances, what does that basically mean? It means people come here, they make wealth, but they don't use that wealth within the American economy. They take that wealth and they send it outside our country to other countries so it benefits other economies. And so you have a massive outflow of wealth going to other countries from the money that they get from working. And the other issues you have is because, of course, a lot of them, they may not have to pay taxes if they're working under the table. A lot of them, even though some of them do pay taxes, mostly just if they work for a business that would require it, though. A lot of them also start getting into the trades. You know, you're working in trade businesses. That also creates the problem where they're putting a lot of trade guys out of business. I know, I mean, again, I actually did an apprenticeship for carpentry. I know I'm a carpenter. I know how to do it. My dad runs a carpentry business. I grew up in a few industries, but that was one of them. A lot of those guys are really struggling because they're getting undercut by all these illegal immigrants. So they can barely make contracts because you go to get a contract, and let's say you have your normal rate, and the next guy is charging like half of what you're charging, and there's barely a profit margin for you because you have all these additional fees. You have all these, you have all the additional fees they don't have, basically. And a lot of those guys too, they cut a lot of corners on materials, which is why you'll notice that if you've had work done in your house, you might notice the materials start to degrade pretty quickly. It's because a lot of those guys, they buy really cheap materials. That's another big issue, by the way. They cut a lot of corners, which is one of the ways they they make it cheaper, frankly, right? Especially with electricity work. The electricians are horrid these days, partly because of that. Again, I did an apprenticeship with carpentry. I learned general with that. I've worked with electricians. I've worked with roofers. I've done a lot. I've done stuff with houses through basically the whole system, including actually plumbing, although I'm not personally skilled with that or electricity, but I have worked with guys who do it. The stuff they find with electricians is terrifying. I knew a guy who was doing electrician work. They found a live wire that had been there for years at this point, that was not attached to anything, and the wood, this was inside the wall, so the owner would never know. The wood around it was all burned. And this guy was telling the homeowner, he's like, you're lucky your house didn't burn down. Whoever did the electricity work there, like they left a live wire. There's also a lot, in America, when you learn a trade, there's also a lot of procedures that you normally follow, which a lot of the illegal immigrants, they don't know about because they're not actually trained. For example, again, if you hire an electrician, even the colors of wires designate certain things. For example, like, is it black designated? I can't remember, don't take my word for it. There's a certain color that designates the live wire. And I mean, I was working with my dad actually a few years back, and he was doing some work on his own house. And he opened up a wall because he was having some electricity problems. He wanted to show me how to do this stuff. And, the wire that was hot, the live wire, was not in accordance with normal trade practices. And so, you have a little tool that can detect which wires are hot and which ones aren't. And he was teaching me the colors of wires and what they referred to. And he was like, oh, this is not what it's supposed to be. You can get people killed by doing that. You can kill people by doing that. And so, you bring in people who they don't know American building codes, they don't know the practices of American trades, and they get involved in the trade business. They cut corners, they rush things, they use cheap materials, and they undercut all the guys doing the work. What happens? Well, the quality of building goes down, but also a lot of guys go out of business because they're doing things the right way and these guys aren't. It's really horrible, actually. And so that is a problem. But the other side too, and I pointed this out before, because there were arguments even with some of the visa programs, the green card programs, and everything else, especially with the high-tech jobs. What is happening to the average American? Now look, I have a lot of friends who are immigrants. My wife is from France, you know what I mean? Her family's from Cambodia. So I know a lot of people who are immigrants. I know a lot of people who are illegal immigrants too, including family members, by the way. Family members by extension. One of the problems Americans are facing is this, and I think this is part of the reason, in addition to crime, in addition to the costs and everything else, part of the reason why I believe Trump kind of won the 2016 campaign on illegal immigration and probably won the 2024 campaign also on illegal immigration. Maybe he'd argue he won the 2021 too on this too, but that's him saying that, right? Part of the reason is this. For Americans, when you go to get a job, what does it look like? You're like, gee, let me get a job at a restaurant. You're fresh out of high school, or maybe you're still in high school, you're a college kid. Let me get a job at a restaurant. You go there, the entire business is, most of the guys are illegal immigrants, right? Okay, I can't get a job here. They're actually pretty good. They're actually some of the better workers in that. My dad ran restaurants. They're actually very good workers in that. They used to be, at least. The new ones, not so much. They're a different breed, but the older ones especially, they were pretty good at it. Gee, let me get a job. I don't know, like picking tomatoes. I'll work at a farm. They have that industry. Let me get a job doing delivery work. They own that. They run that industry. Let me get a job working at McDonald's. I don't know about that one, but at least in New York, they run that industry basically too. Geez, well, I can't get a job. What am I going to do? Well, you know what? Let me learn a trade. I'm going to go to trade school. You go to trade school, you learn a trade, you get a job. Hey, geez, all the illegal immigrants run this too. They used to be a lot of the assistants. Now they're starting their own businesses. A lot of them run their own businesses now because they found, why do we want to go through these guys? You can't get a job there either. The trades are dominated by them. So you can't get the low-paying jobs, fresh out of high school. You can't get the trade jobs because of illegal immigration. Gee, let me go to college and get a very good degree, and let me go into, IT or technology or a very good high-tech white-collar job. And what happens? Well, you go there and you find that it's all, green card holders. You find that they've been bringing people in from other countries, like Indians and stuff like that, or they're offshoring the jobs. Maybe at best you get the job and then you have to train your, green card replacement. That has happened at a lot of companies. Or maybe a new owner comes in and he fires everybody and replaces them with green card holders from other countries. And the argument is, well, you know what? These people are more skilled, but they're also willing to work for a lot cheaper. Where do you go? You can't work the basic jobs. You can't work the trade jobs. You can't work the white-collar jobs. In New York, they're even making it so you can, even the police force is open to non-citizens. You can't even work some of the government jobs anymore. Where does the average American go? And so you're left with basically two choices. You either give up on life or work, or you have to work at a much lower wage. Because part of the reason why people hire these individuals is because they're willing to work at lower wages. The quality of life for Americans has been decimated by this. And that's in addition to the points that KM has noted. One of the reasons you have overcrowding in schools. I mean, look, what are you going to do? You're going to not let kids go to school? So, you do have families coming here. They have children. They're illegal immigrants. They go to school. The schools are overcrowded. You have 30, maybe even more kids per classroom. How are you going to learn anything? The teacher doesn't have time to individually work with any student when you have that many kids. A lot of them, they need ESL, English as second language. And what happens? Well, the school has to divert budgets from other things. So they're getting rid of after-school activities. They're getting rid of, in some places, they need security. They're getting rid of that. And then you start developing gang problems because of the gang cultures that start developing. It's horrible. And so kids lose opportunities. The quality of education goes down. It's terrible. Then there's the issue with the medical system, which is just being decimated because they get free health care. Even aside from Medicare, Medicaid, because hospitals can't turn people away. And if you're undocumented, quote unquote, if you're an illegal immigrant, you don't have documents. There's no way the hospitals can go after you for payment. Americans also shoulder that cost through medical costs. So you shoulder that cost. And then in addition to the housing market, supply and demand, a lot of laws have limited the production of new homes. What happens? Well, supply and demand, you have 20 homes and you have 30 people competing for 20 homes. What happens? They increase the price through the roof and you can't afford a house anymore. So, the quality of life for Americans has been so badly impacted by this that I do think that's why it has become such a big issue for Americans. And that's in addition to other things, just the basic cost of living, the quality of life, the crime, crime is depending on where you live, has been getting really bad. I experienced this personally. I've mentioned before, when I moved out of New York, I now live in New Jersey. I moved out of New York during COVID, and during that time, of course, you had a lot of the migrant caravans. The neighborhood I lived in was Jackson Heights. I lived near Roosevelt Avenue, which is where you see a lot of the viral videos on like open prostitution now and people selling stolen goods on the corner and MS-13 selling stolen identities literally on the corner. Not far from me is where they had that incident several years back where an MS-13 member shot a guy on the subway platform. That was my neighborhood. I lived there. It used to be not that bad. The area I lived in, it was a migrant community, so most of my neighbors were from Dominican Republic and stuff like that. But when they started bringing in a lot of the illegal immigrants, it got really bad. It got really, really bad to the point where I was worried about the safety of my family. I'd go to use the subway and you would have to pay a gang member and they would swipe a card to let you through the subway. And if you shouldered past them, which I did a few times, they would threaten you. And the police weren't doing anything about it. You'd have police sitting there, and I'm not trying to go out, I'm not trying to insult the police in New York. I don't believe they were allowed to do their jobs. You literally had police standing there, and you have gang members at every single entrance to the subway, and you have to pay them and not swipe your own card to use the subway. That was happening in Jackson Heights, in New York City. And so, I mean, when I talk about crime, like that was my personal experience. And then you're walking with your kid and you have to walk by prostitutes, just being in the open on the streets. You have to walk by like drug addicts, and I mean, it was really bad. And so I watched my neighborhood go from being like an okay neighborhood to a really, really, really bad neighborhood. And I would imagine, I assume that maybe a lot of other places experience similar things. And I would assume also that's another thing that has impacted people's livelihoods. I mean, it's pretty crazy stuff. And so when Americans on top of that find that, your money is being used to support these people, like it's like insult to injury. And I think that's where a lot of people are at with this. I think it's why actually the illegal immigration issue is not really even so partisan. You even find a lot of they say Latino young men, they're huge MAGA supporters now. I wonder why. It's probably because they see this stuff. Another question here, Seymour Butts, you're saying, Josh, wasn't it against the law to be a communist here in the U.S. at one time? When did that change? Yeah, so back on that point, it's complicated. So technically, even right now, if you are migrating to the United States, you are still asked on the form and on the interview process, are you or have you ever been a member of a communist party? And I don't know what happens if you say yes. I don't know if they turn you away. You can say, I quit the Communist Party. For China, this is a big issue because, look, if you have any money, if you're able to probably immigrate in the first place, you probably were or still are a member of the Chinese Communist Party. Or when you were a kid, you had to join the Youth League or the Young Pioneers. Given that point, a lot of them have quit the CCP. You actually have a kind of a silent revolution taking place in China. A lot of people are quietly quitting the CCP. It's called the Tweedong movement. They still do ask you that during the immigration system. Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? That's still in place. From what I understand, it is still to this day, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's still to this day illegal for an elected official to be a member of a Communist Party, which is probably why a lot of elected officials who are communists, they don't call themselves communists. They're like, I'm a democratic socialist. It's different. Yeah, okay. If you say so. You know what I mean? And yeah, we might work with the Revolutionary Communist Party or the Communist Party USA, but you know what? We're just fellow travelers, right? Don't put me in prison, please. They won't put you in prison, but they might make it so you can't run for elected office. Part of the reason that was in place, by the way, part of the reason that was in place is because during the Cold War, which is, I mean, really not that long ago, like what you're talking about, like late 80s, early 90s it went to, right? If you were a member of a communist party, the entire global communist movement was part of Russia, the Soviet Union. They were the leaders of the global communist revolution, right? They call it the Comintern, the Communist International. The Comintern was run by the Soviet Union. And so if you were part of a communist party, it meant that you had sworn loyalty to the Soviet Union. And so America was at war with the Soviet Union, right? And so that was the issue with that. Post-Cold War, it kind of went away. Post-Cold War, the issue, though, is a lot of the communist parties stopped being loyal to the Soviet Union and started being loyal to the Chinese Communist Party. And so the CCP just took that over. Now, it's not really treated that way at this point, but in my opinion, it should be. Yeah, this is also why you find that a lot of these Communist Party movements that are behind a lot of the grassroots protests in the United States, behind a lot of the riots in the United States, BLM, they said they're trained Marxists. Some of the groups tied in with them are Communist Party organizations, and many of them have ties to the CCP. Why is that? Many of the groups behind the pro-Gaza protests are tied in with Communist Party organizations, which in turn have ties to the CCP. Why is that? It's because the CCP is now in place of Russia, the leader of the global communist revolution. And all those communist groups, or at least most of them, have some form of connection to the CCP. Now, in my opinion, we should regard that still to this day as we regarded, the issue with the Soviet Union. The complication with the CCP is because we become so financially intertangled with them that they're not regarded as an enemy of the United States to the extent that the Soviets were. It's a bit of a frenemy process where they say every day that the goal of the CCP is to destroy the United States. They declare they're at war with us. They declare we're their biggest enemy. They say we live, you die, meaning that there can be no America and China coexisting in the future. And they state, and they subvert us, they do everything else, and they just state publicly they want to destroy us. And we acknowledge that, but we're like, hey, you know what, but we'd still like to do business with you. And that's how it works. So maybe that's changing now. Maybe that is changing now that the financial intertwining is being eliminated. But without a doubt, you still have it that a lot of people tied in with these communist groups are in fact tied in with the CCP. And in my opinion, it should be regarded as just as controversial as it was during during the Cold War, personally. Aaron Shimano, you're saying, 2 days ago you said Xi, as in Xi Jinping, is not in control of the military anymore. But then who is? Are they better or worse than Xi? I'm terrible with names of some of these officials. Is it Joe? Is it Joe and Lai? I can't remember. There are suspicions. It's not super clear cut who is in charge of the current rival system. A lot of people believe that the official, I want to say Joe and Lai, but I might have that wrong. A lot of people believe that, and this is within like the Chinese community, right? I'm sorry, not Zhou Enlai, not Zhou Enlai, he's dead. A lot of people believe that the official who is leading this is an individual who is a CCP member, but he's generally not, he doesn't have as much blood on his hands, let's put it that way. There are some beliefs that this individual is not as bad as Xi Jinping, but the problem is, the issue is not so much who leads the CCP. The issue is the CCP itself. Like, you can replace the CCP leader, and it's still going to be just as bad. Like, it was just as bad under every other leader. And this is the problem that you sometimes get within how people view the Chinese Communist Party. The problem with the Chinese Communist Party is not Xi Jinping. The problem of the Chinese Communist Party is the Chinese Communist Party. It's just whoever the figurehead is the one, in the mouth of the snake, so to speak. You know what I mean? It's not going to change. The CCP is the problem. And so even when you have these rival factions, you can have one that's like hypothetically not as bad, but they're still terrible. Like, you know what I mean? You do have infighting right now, as you've had for a long time. The current rivalry to Xi Jinping heavily within the Chinese military right now. And they have effectively now purged some of the key Xi Jinping loyalists to the extent that Xi Jinping would not be able to exert control over the Chinese military. And this is big. I'm going to touch on some of this probably more soon because there's a lot going on, and it's kind of complicated, but I'll touch on it soon. If you want to learn more in the meantime, though, Tiffany Meyer, one of my colleagues, again, I do a show called Primetime with her. She does a show called China in Focus, and I know they've done some fantastic reporting on this. So if you want to get an idea of what's been going on, check out the show China in Focus. They do really, really good reporting on this stuff. In my opinion, the best out there. So you can check that out. All right, folks, that said, happy Friday. Yeah, enjoy your weekend. I hope you all enjoy some time with your families. Join me again tonight, not even next week. Join me tonight because we have our show, speaking of primetime, that's going to be 8 o'clock tonight. It's a great show. It's a lot more casual. It's, we joke around and stuff. That'll be 8 o'clock p.m. Be sure to check it out. That's me, Tiffany Myers, I mentioned, a few other colleagues, including Roman. And that said, folks, enjoy your weekend. I will see you again also on Monday, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And in the meantime, do not forget to like this video, and also please leave a comment. It does help us as well in terms of the algorithm. All right, folks, that said, as always, please take care of yourselves. Stay informed and stay free. Thank you.